Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. As you are aware, we are in a series of lectures collectively entitled Cultural Studies. Let me welcome you to this lecture on memetics and see how memetics could be a part of cultural studies. Now, as always, let us do a recap of the last lecture. In the last lecture, which was devoted to the origins of the modern mind, we took the help of a work by Merlin Donald in a bit to understand, the narrative, the way the origin of the origins of the modern mind, that mind that created culture, okay? The way the narrative of the growth and development of such a mind is sketched out. I also added a caveat in that lecture, wherein I said that this may not be the one we are following, that is the narrative sketched out by Merlin Donald, need not be the only or even the the only authentic picture of how it began. After all, as you saw in our lecture in evolutionary psychology, these are always processes of reverse engineering. Okay, we go back by looking at our current current propensities and current capabilities, right. So, the essay that we looked at was Origins of the Modern Mind and the 3 stages, and we found that there were 3 major transformations in that. The first transition involved mimetic skill and auto-cueing, and we understood auto-cueing as recollection in memory that did not need any external clues, right, and mimetic skill as representation using the whole body. Second, we found that in the next transition, there was lexical invention which eventually led to the formation of myths, okay, and storytelling, that is narrative thought. And finally, we saw that the third transition involved the externalization of memory, where memory is not only in our brains, where memory is external and stored in things like books, in hard disks, okay, in CDs, etc., and how that gave us indeed a new memory representation and a new working memory architecture. The important point is, however, that we are not studying these things from a physiological or anatomical point of view, okay, not even from a purely evolutionary biology point of view. Why we are bringing in is because as I said earlier, we are looking at what science has to tell us, okay, about ourselves, about the kind of beings that we are, the kind of complex organisms that we are, okay. And all these 3 transitional phases, that is mimetic skill and auto-cueing, then the descent of the larynx leading to more and more vowel sounds and the growth of the lexicon, the expansion of the brain, okay. Then the externalization of memory, all these were, as Donald said, played out at the cultural level, and that is why we needed to look at these in the first place. Then the first transition is something we have already been through, so I will not look at this slide. So, this is the second transition which gave us a capacity for lexical invention and a high speed phonological apparatus, and these were the 2 new features. And the third transition we call the external memory storage and retrieval system and a new working memory architecture, right. So, we are now going to look at memetics And let me at the beginning say that memetics, let me tell you why I have brought in the study of memetics here, and this is really an end of one phase of looking at cultural studies in our lectures from a scientific perspective, wherein we had said early on that we cannot leave out what science has to say. Remember what Barker said, that the empirical rigors of science are something that also that spirit has to be incorporated into cultural studies, and the bicultural perspective is something that we cannot do without. Okay? Without the bicultural perspective, we would not have the proper foundation, so to speak. We would only be talking about floating signifiers and signifying practices, one of the criticisms, okay, levied against cultural studies, right. The essay that would be our main reference point is a chapter in a very famous book, a very popular book by Richard Dawkins, namely The Selfish Gene, where he has towards the end a chapter on memetics, and memetics is an attempt, right. It is an attempt to explain culture using the analogy from genetics. Okay. So, if you look at the term genetics and memetics, first they do rhyme. Okay. More importantly, if the gene is the the unit, right, or the basic unit in genetics. So, the analogy that Dawkins draws is between, our memetics as a whole draws, is between the gene and the meme as basic units respectively of the physical and the mental or the cultural. Well, so let us see what this field, however curious a science it is dubbed to be, but there are of course also many adherents to memetics, and so we need to see what memetics tells us about ourselves as cultural beings. The key source texts in this lecture are Chris Barker's Cultural Studies Theory and Practice, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, and Susan Blackmore's The Meme Machine. Okay. So, let us now define memetics, okay, and we shall define the field of memetics after the definition given by scholars like Richard Dawkins, and this is the definition of memetics as a discourse: the theoretical and empirical science that studies the replication, spread and evolution of memes. So, we saw just a while ago that memes are the basic units of cultural transmission. Okay. Memes are information units that we have, and we shall see in a way. This entire lecture will be devoted to the way memes work and what they are, meme complexes, etc. Okay. And the analogy you see here is with the gene. So, the gene evolution and meme evolution are, that is an analogy being drawn by Dawkins. Okay. We of course have to understand that, like many areas in knowledge formation, like many procedures in knowledge formation, there is also, this is the relation is analogous in nature, but it does throw very interesting lights. Okay. If we have to talk about also as us having one basic unit, that is the meme. Now, what is the significance of studying memetics? Now, the significance of studying memetics. Now, what is memetics? Again, the theoretical and empirical science that studies the replication, spread and evolution of basic cultural units known as memes. So, they construct evolutionary models of information transfer. This is important. Okay. Information transfer from brain to brain, also knowledge transfer eventually from brain to brain, are seen or can be modeled along evolutionary processes, like we have done the modeling of the evolutionary processes of the gene. Second, it also is very important as a theory of the mind. Okay. That is also how the mind works, in the sense that how our information, bits of information imitated. Okay. Later on we find that memetics comes from the Greek word mimesis, okay, which means imitation. So, how do we imitate one another, okay, as far as knowledge is concerned. Knowledge is basically by and large, okay, a matter of imitation. So, as a theory of mind and how the mind works, it is supposed to be valuable for us. And finally, MIMS as external observable cultural artifacts and behaviors. Okay. MIMS are actual things, and we shall see in a while very interestingly how they are, even though they are objects in the mind, how they can also be actual. So, MIMS are also observable, okay, external to us, even they are there in our brains, they are observable, they are cultural artifacts and behaviors that we may we may observe, we may comment upon, and we may explore from a scientific and cultural point of view. Okay. So, the significance of again the discourse of memetics is this, that memetics gives us models of information transfer, right, cultural transfer. Second, memetics is important and useful as a theory of mind, and MIMS are they are externally observable by us as units of behavior, okay, and units of cultural artifacts. Fine. So, now you have an idea of what memetics is and the why it could be useful for us from a cultural studies perspective. Many books on cultural studies do have a chapter or do at least have a section on memetics, because it is one of the theories of cultural transfer, right. Now, I am reading from Dawkins's chapter on memetics, which I said was the text from which many of the points and quotations would be given. And as always, Dawkins is also one of my favorite writers. He has authored so many books, for instance, The God Delusion, then of course, The Selfish Gene and Climbing Mount Improbable, etc. Okay. Unweaving the Rainbow. So, some of the books even though he is a biologist, well, perhaps because he is a biologist, okay, there is he has a beautiful felicity, okay, in his writing, if not also quite an unforgiving attitude to those who practice religion, right. So, Dawkins is really one of my favorite writers. Now, let us see what he has to say. He says, most of what is unusual about man can be summed up in one word, culture. So, here you see a definition of human beings, of definition of man as a species being given from the point of view of culture, right. We have definitions of man given from the point of view of religion, from the point of view of science, for instance. Okay. Here he says whatever is unusual about us, at least compared to other species, is culture. Now, this is not to say that other species do not have culture, okay, but the level of sophistication that we have, the level of variety that we have, the complexity that we have in our cultural formations, in our cultural behaviors, in our practices, and in the artifacts that we create. Definitely, these are incomparable, and that is what makes, according to Dawkins, makes us unusual as a species. Then let us read on again. I use the word not in its snobbish sense, but as a scientist uses it. Okay. So, he says this is important, and that is why we need to look at this. He says, I am looking at the word culture not in a snobbish sense. Further, cultural transmission is analogous to genetic transmission in that, although basically conservative, it can give rise to a form of evolution. I would say this part of the essay, or these lines, are the most important. Okay, it needs to be quoted here. Cultural transmission is analogous to genetic transmission in that, although basically conservative, it can give rise to a form of evolution. What do we mean by conservative here? Conservative here does not, though it is analogous, does not mean the way we understand conservative as somebody having conservative views or orthodox views. Conservative here means, more resistant, right, to change, right. So, you cannot have changes very quickly. He says cultural transmission is also, it is not that culture changes very quickly or very frequently. There are things that are conservative in culture, but at the same time it does give rise to change, and it is this, what is this form of evolution of cultural change? How does it change? How does it evolve, really, using words from biology? This is what is the aim of Richard Dawkins and the aim of other practitioners of memetics like Susan Blackmore, as I have mentioned a while ago. Okay. And it is in this spirit that we have to look at memetics as a part of cultural studies. Therefore, if you look at this diagram here, cultural transmission and genetic transmission both are processes of evolution. Then what what comprises memetics? Okay, what are memes? And this is what Dawkins has to say. Fashions in dress and diet, ceremonies and customs, art and architecture, engineering and technology, okay, all evolve in historical time that looks like highly speeded up genetic evolution, but has nothing to do with genetic evolution. Okay. So, anything cultural, anything you would even say man-made, be it the high technology that you are learning, be it art, be it even things like fashion or even fads in music and dress, be these customs, rituals and ceremonies that we practice, okay, architectural designs and forms, all these things are to be studied under memetics. Why? Because they are cultural forms, okay, and importantly that they have a trajectory of development or trajectory of evolution that has, this says, nothing to do with genetic evolution. So, now we all this while we have been talking about genetic evolution, okay, biological evolution. So, now we have another aspect being shown to us by Dawkins, and that is a memetic evolution, okay, or evolution of culture or cultural units. So, this should be very interesting to us, and let us see how this is also, culture is also implicated in a series of evolutionary processes and stages, right. So, look at this slide please. As we saw again, fashions, ceremonies, art, customs, architecture, technology, all these things fall under the study of memetics, and all these things, as you know, are part and parcel of our culture. They lead to cultural practices. Okay. The fashion that you follow is a cultural practice. Okay. It is not only that customs are a cultural practice, the kind your get up, the way the way you turn yourself out, okay, these are also matters of culture. So, on a more serious note now, what I would like to bring to your notice is that something very important that we find in his chapter on memetics, okay, and this is something that not many people have really articulated, right. It is said that compared to chemistry and physics, right. If you look at the sciences, the hard sciences, that is, compared to chemistry and physics, it is said that in biology it is more difficult to have laws. Okay. Listen to this carefully. There are many who have agreed with this formulation made by scientists, that whereas in chemistry and physics you do have laws, right. Laws that are very strong, for instance, the laws of motion of Newton, the laws of gravitation, right. In biology, we do not really have a fundamental law. So, he says that, well, I want to here attempt to formulate a fundamental law of all life, right. And the fundamental law, he says, is that all life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities. Listen to this very carefully. All life, whether it is memetic life, cultural life, whether it is genetic life, and he even says in his, he also says in his essay, reverberating electronic circuits, right. All kinds of life, if we at all accept that reverberating electronic circuits are also life of some kind. Okay. All life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities. These are all replicating entities, entities that are repeated, that replicate themselves, right. This word is something you will find also in our lectures on evolution. The whole idea of differential survival, it is not survival per se, but difference in survival rates, right, in members of a population, that is the bedrock of Darwinian evolutionary theory, right. why does one why does one organism fail while the other survives, right. So, if you look, I at least get increasingly drawn, from a very limited interest in biology, I get increasingly drawn by this statement by Dawkins, that all life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities, and I find it immensely interesting that he is applying this to the cultural realm as well. Now, he then asks this fundamental question: are genes the only replicators? Okay, we have always said that genes are replicators, they get transmitted from generation to generation. And he says that, well, all this while the sciences have told us that genes are the fundamental replicators of the world. Can we not say that there is something else that is also evolving, and something else that is also evolving by differential survival, that is also replicating itself, right? And then he has an answer to this question. He says that the MIMS, or what are MIMS again? Let us recall the definition of MIMS. MIMS are the basic units of cultural transmission. Okay? As genes are the basic units of genetic transmission, MIMS are the basic units of cultural transmission. Remember, this entire discourse of memetics has to be understood and read sort of in tandem with the discourse of genetics. Okay? And then you find the striking similarities, and at some points, of course, you see that the similarity stops and memetics goes on to have a life of its own and a rationale and discourse of its own. So, then let us again read from Dawkins' text. MIM is an information pattern, as we have seen, held in an individual's brain, which is capable of being copied to another or several individuals' memory. Okay? So, MIM therefore, we have talked about the MIM as a cultural unit. Here we have another perspective on the MIM. Okay? The MIM is an information pattern which is held in an individual's brain. Even then, a patch of a song is an information pattern that is held in your brain. A short melody can also be an information pattern which is there in your brain. And interestingly, Dawkins follows a scientist named Humphrey, N.K. Humphrey, by citing him and saying that, well, MIMS are not just MIMS are not just a pattern that is virtual. MIMS are also physical things. Now, you may wonder how a MIM is supposed to be physical, how a MIM that is to do with culture, that it has to do with thoughts and patterns can be a physical one. Okay? The point is, every thought, whether cultural or not, to do with culture or not, or cultural practices and forms, every thought actually is physical. Okay, many of you have now probably getting what I am saying, or what Dawkins is saying through Humphrey, is that if thinking has to do with the firing of neurons inside your brain, okay, then patterns are created, right. A thought is then involved with neural firing, okay, the firing of neurons, and in that sense it becomes a physical entity. It becomes sort of real entity, other than as we understand thoughts as being different from our brains. Thoughts are not different from our brains. Thoughts are part and parcel of the entire process of the brain. So, MIM is let us look at this slide. MIM is an information pattern held in an individual's brain, which is capable of being copied to another or several individuals' memory. The etymology of the word relates to the Greek word mimeme. This is important, for something imitated. As I mentioned a while ago, the word memetics comes from mim. Mim is borrowing from the Greek root word, the Greek word mimeme, for means something imitated. So, now we know that the process of transmission of these memetic units, okay, has to be imitation. Right. So, we imitate, if you if you consider it very deeply, if you reflect on it, you will understand that most of the things that we do are imitations. So, imitation is this is not to deny that there are no improvements in knowledge and there are no radically new findings, but essentially as learners what we do is we imitate. So, again this slide, as Dawkins says, here it refers to evolutionary principles in explaining the spread of ideas and cultural phenomena. So, all these lectures before this we saw evolution came in a big way in a couple of lectures, and we are really ending this part of this module by finally trying to sort of crack the cultural code, if I may use the word, okay, to finally see how we may explain cultural evolution. Therefore, mime is miming or something imitated, and then Dawkins says that we have made an analogy, we have rhyme genetics and memetics, we have talked about gene and mime, okay, we have made an analogy, but we need to stop here, right, and see how memetics can be carved out as as a discourse in its own right that does not borrow or lean so heavily on genetics. Okay. So, let us read from him. For an understanding of the evolution of modern man, we must begin by throwing out the gene as the sole basis of our ideas on evolution. Mime can be termed as a noun that conveys the unit of cultural transmission or a unit of imitation. A mime could consist of a single word, or a mime could consist of the entire speech in which that word first occurred. So, a mime and its pattern may hold one word, simple word, as I said, a part of a symphony or an entire symphony. Therefore, we see that the mime is a noun, and as a noun it is a unit of cultural transmission or of imitation. Then Dawkins goes on to again draw, he says that like we have gene pools, we also have mime pools, right. In the gene pools, we have genes that are used for reproduction. In the mime pools, there are mimes, okay, that are transferred to through a process, or that are reproduced rather through imitation. So, examples of mimes again may be, and he explicates this further by saying that these are tunes, okay, from music, these are ideas, these are catchphrases, clothes, fashion, technology, even language, and even religion, okay, because all these have to do with culture or way of life. Okay. Show me any one of this that is not part of culture or way of living or part of our cultural forms and practices, right. Then Dawkins moves into an area which many may consider controversial. He believes that the idea of God is really a psychological crutch that human beings need in the face of in the face of despair, in the face of the unknown, in the face of grief, okay, that it's a crutch that's very important. It's not that it's not important, okay, and he in a way by saying that it's a psychological crutch, however indirectly, okay, is saying that this is something that is used by people. But he also talks about the fact that after all, as as a part of our thinking, okay, as a thought unit, God should be and has to be considered also a mime, okay, or a cultural object that is there in our brains. And then in typical Dawkins style, this is how he argues, okay, against the existence of God, and he says this: the everlasting arms, obviously referring to God. God is shown as somebody who will embrace us after our death, okay, into his everlasting arms. The everlasting arms hold out a cushion against our own inadequacies, which, like, look at this, a doctor's placebo is nonetheless effective for being imaginary. Look at this very carefully. He says that the idea that there is a God who will always protect us, the idea that it's like a safety cushion, right? It's a cushion that that protects us from our own inadequacies. If you look at ourselves without the idea of God in a godless universe. It is very few people have the courage, really, if I may use the word after Dawkins, to live in a world or live in a perceiving situation in which live with the perception that this is a godless universe, okay, that things have evolved and have a totally scientific, also science based, scientific finding based, approach to God. So, he says that this is like a doctor's placebo. Now, what is a placebo? You know that a placebo is a sort of a tablet that is given by the doctor or a nurse to a patient, and that tablet is not exactly a drug. It may be it is something that is maybe a vitamin or something which is a sweet object, okay, and the patient is given the placebo and is told that this is a drug, that this is a medicine that is going to cure you. For various reasons, medical reasons, placebos are given, but the patient takes it with the belief. Okay. Now, this is very important, takes it with the belief that he or she will be cured by this drug or by this item of medication, right. So, he says, he draws this analogy and he says that the idea of God is like a safety cushion, is like a doctor's placebo, which is nonetheless effective for being imaginary. It is imaginary, but at the same time it is effective and has probably, if we were all to not believe in a universe created by God, then probably many of us would psychologically not be able to cope with that sort of a reality. Then he says God exists if only in the form of a meme with high survival value. Okay. The idea of God has been there since so many hundreds of years, and the idea of God probably is there to stay also for some time. God exists if only in the form of a meme with high survival value, evolutionary speaking, or infective power. Look at the word he uses, infective power in the environment provided by human culture. So, the idea of no God and the idea of God, if you say that evolutionary, in an evolutionary schema, the idea of God by differential survival, the idea of God has survived, while the idea of no God is yet to has not survived, or is yet to sort of as Dawkins would believe, is yet to make itself win over the idea of a God, right. So, it has high survival value, one of the requirements of a meme to survive, and we shall see there are other the other qualities that memes should have to survive. So, what are the features that memes should have in order to survive? These are longevity, fecundity and copying fidelity. A meme has to be around for a certain amount of time to be transmitted, okay, to be accepted by people and to be transmitted from, as it says, from brain to brain. Okay. Then there has to be a certain fertility, fecundity about the meme, and there has to be a certain copying fidelity. You can not say that the meme has been transmitted and give a radically different view, okay, of the meme. He gives an example of Darwin's theory of evolution, right. Say in passing from person A to person B, Darwin's theory of evolution may undergo changes, right, but the essential components and the essential, so to speak, description or delineation of Darwin's theory as he gave it, that is something that has a fidelity about it, okay, and we are expected as teachers, when we teach it or refer to it, we are expected to be as close to the original as possible, right. So, these are again an important point in his essay, that these are the three features that are required for a meme for it to have a survival value. Then there is another interesting portion where he talks about mutually assisting memes, right. He says that memes are never in isolation, right. Memes are not discrete units. Memes, we know that memes are there in the meme pool, like genes are there in the gene pool. He also says that some memes sort of, if you look at visually, some memes come together and coalesce, right, to form certain complexes, right, where they assist one another. One meme will help another. Now, you can take the idea, he also gives us the idea of God and the ideas in religion, right. He says, now let us read from him. Some memes become associated with one another, and this association assists the survival of each of the participating memes, leading to a very strong what we call meme complex. Okay. To take a particular example, Dawkins says, an aspect of doctrine that has been very effective in enforcing religious observance is the threat of hellfire, right. So, the idea of God, the idea is tied to the idea of eternal punishment or of eternal damnation or eternal reward. You cannot separate the two. You cannot simply say that there, at least in established religion, right. You cannot say that only the idea of God is there or that God exists. Okay. There are many supporting cultural institutions, cultural forms and memes. There are many kind of thoughts or units of thought that add or fortify, so to speak, these mega memes like the God meme, right. So, the threat of hellfire after death, depending on what kind of life we have led. If we have led a so called bad life, then we are supposed to burn in hell, as the famous phrase goes, right. Then he says, however, so he therefore is not simply describing these things and telling us in a very academic sort of way or in a in a non involved sort of way what memes are. He has his own way of putting things, as it were. And this is what he says: the threat of hellfire is a peculiarly nasty technique of persuasion, causing great psychological anguish throughout the Middle Ages and even today, but it is highly effective. Okay? So, you see the God meme has survived. The God meme may have caused a lot of anguish in people, and certainly in children. If he says, that is what Dawkins says, if you indoctrinate children in the idea of if you do this bad thing, you will rot in hell or burn in hell. He says this is extremely damaging for children, and it has in earlier times caused a great deal of psychological anguish in humanities, particularly in the Christian world, right. Then he gives us an example of how, all this while we have been talking about memes and genes, but he says, I said earlier, that he is going to come away from genes and is going to show us some differences. Well, he says that memes and genes may not always reinforce one another. Okay? Now, let us read. He says conflicts among memes and genes, and I will quickly go through his words. Memes and genes may reinforce each other, but they sometimes come into opposition. Meme complexes evolved in the same kind of way as co-adapted gene complexes, that is what we have seen. Selection favors memes that exploit the cultural environment to their own advantage, and this is, the God meme, for instance, is an example, or other memes, these are examples of a meme being able to exploit its cultural environment, which is essentially we identify, Dawkins identifies as an environment of fear of the unknown, okay, fear of death, fear of loss, grief, etc. Okay. And this is how memes, as he says, fortify themselves. But he says that it is not necessary that memetics and genetics have to go together. Now, he gives us an interesting example of celibacy, right, and he says that celibacy, if celibacy is a meme or a thought in our minds, an idea in our minds, then, and if genetics is about, or if evolution and survival is also tied into reproduction, and we are supposed to transmit our genes, right, to the next generation, then how do you explain celibacy? Celibacy then becomes an anomaly, right, it becomes like suicide. Okay. Like suicide, celibacy also becomes an analogy, right. In suicide, you are negating one of the pillars of Darwinian evolution, which is survival. in celibacy you are negating another pillar of Darwinian evolution, that is reproduction. Okay. So, let us see how he puts it. For example, the habit of celibacy is presumably not inherited genetically. A gene for celibacy, puts it beautifully, a gene for celibacy is doomed to failure in the gene pool, a MIM, whereas a MIM for celibacy can be successful in the MIM pool. Now, celibacy particularly, if we see it as another supporting MIM for the God MIM, okay, as far as priests in some denominations are expected to be celibate. In that case, what happens is, we know that MIM is successful because it is part, it has survived, and it has also helped, the greater God MIM complex. Okay. It has been an addition to, it has fortified the greater God MIM complex, but it is a failure as far as genetics is concerned. That is why Dawkins says that we have to, at some point of time, we cannot move on, the MIM cannot be simply following the gene or the trajectory of the gene. Culture is therefore different, from certain natural propensities, if I use a word like natural selection, like survival and reproduction. So, that we may have completely, things completely at odd, MIMs completely at odds, like suicide and celibacy, that are at odds with the discourse of genetics. That is why, memetics is an area, I believe, which needs to be explored in cultural studies. Then comes another point, which he says that, he says we are gene machines, right. In one way of describing ourselves, of course, we are gene machines and we are created to pass on our genes to the next generation. And those, sort of scientists who are completely with the gene, or who see everything in terms of the gene, okay, would also, some have even called the human body simply a vehicle for the transmission of genes. That is one way of looking and describing the human being, that we are just vehicles because these things called genes want to replicate and get passed on. Anyhow, we are gene machines and we are created to pass on our genes to the next generation. But he says, it is wrong, or it is futile really for us to think that our immortality lives, that is in our genes. Okay. Many people, you have seen, this is also the staple of movies, the staple of literature, believe that it's only when you have children that you pass on. Only when you have children that you are immortalized in your children, that through your genes you are immortalized, okay, because your children are carrying your genes. But he says, well, if you have to want immortality, then you surely have to look elsewhere and not at the gene. Because as he says in the slide, as each generation passes, the contribution of our genes are halved. That is the scientific truth. Right. So, by the time he says that what happens then to the gene of these genes of these people like Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, or Galileo, for instance, okay, what is the fate of their genes if their genes are halved, the contribution of our genes are halved as both parents contribute to the progeny. Okay. So, beautifully put. So, he says, so immortality should not be sought through reproduction, to physical reproduction. If at all we want immortality, we have immortality through memetic reproduction. We remember Socrates, we remember Einstein, we remember Newton, Marie Curie, we remember all these great personalities, Mozart, Beethoven. We remember them not through people who are so many generations removed from them. We do not even know, how many of us know who whether Galileo had children, okay, Newton did not have children, how many of us know where the genes of Socrates are, right. So, he says if you have to want or if you have to aim at immortality, then aim at immortality through your MIMs and not through your genes. Aim at immortality through your cultural contribution. Now, by cultural contribution, we mean contribution in various levels of human activity and human thinking and human knowledge. Okay. Hence, he says, so immortality should not be sought through reproduction. Then we shall end with the points that in fact are extremely important as far as memetics is concerned, and it does away with some of our fears. For instance, he says that all these things that we are talking about, all these things that memetics talks about, does it mean that we are meme machines, and that does it mean that we are gene machines, and that we are completely slaves of these, that our brains are simply carriers, vehicles for thoughts and memes, that our bodies are vehicles for carrying genes? Is that all that we are, or is there a way out? And he says definitely there is a way out, and he points to two characteristics that we have, our redeeming characteristics, so to speak. And let us look at this slide. These are that human beings have conscious foresight, and that human beings have altruism. Okay. So, so well put by Dawkins, we should think, right, that we have conscious foresight. We are not all the time looking for short term gains, we are looking for long term gains, for which we can sacrifice some of our memes, for which we can we can remove some of our memes from our system, or how do I put it, so that we can ignore some of our memetic propensities. Okay. Why? Because we have a quality known as conscious foresight. The quality of conscious foresight does not drop from the heavens really. It is part and parcel of our evolutionary lineage, right. We have learned through trial and error methods to retain this characteristic of conscious foresight, of trying to sacrifice the small gains for a much bigger gain. And the other point is altruism, right. Our propensity to help people, right, our propensity to sacrifice, particularly for kin, right. These are things that save us from being slavish imitators of memes, of thoughts, of cultural products, right. So, these are the two things which, as he said, help us from being victims, as it were, to memes. And let us see how he says it. He ends by saying, we are built as gene machines and cultured as meme machines, but we have the power to turn against our own creators, that is the gene and the meme. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators, and in that sense he is using the term selfish. Now, selfish here again, many may have thought about what does he mean by giving a title like the selfish gene. Now, we should not think of it in terms of the way we understand human beings as being selfish for some end, something for our own good, or we would be doing an sort of anthropocentric fallacy here if we say that genes also think like us. The point here, and this is where how Dawkins has also explained elsewhere, he says that when I say selfish, I mean that it is a characteristic built into the gene, and by analogy it is a characteristic built into the meme. We at least know as human beings that we can be selfish, or we are not selfish, or in some cases we decide not to be selfish, which means that we have a meta thinking in which we understand that we are capable of selfishness. Genes and memes, on the other hand, are selfish in the sense that selfishness is built into them, into the nature of the gene and the meme. Why? Because they simply they also call the blind replicators. Their job is to replicate. Their job is to replicate themselves. So, in that sense he says that genes and memes are now part of us. They are not, then in another sense they are not our creators. And then he says, we alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. Fine. So, we will now go into the discussion. And if you get a question like define memetics, we then say after Richard Dawkins that memetics is a theoretical and empirical science that studies what? The replication, spread and evolution of something known as memes. And then we go on to explain that memes may be defined as units of cultural transmission. Then second question, how according to Dawkins is cultural transmission analogous to genetic transmission? Now, we will use refer to this portion of his essay where he says that cultural transmission is analogous to genetic transmission because it can give rise to a form of evolution, and evolution really is the connecting term here. Why? Because we are understanding both genetic evolution and memetic genetic reproduction and memetic reproduction or imitation through as an evolutionary process. Okay. Then what according to Dawkins is the fundamental law of all life, this is really my favorite, all life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities, and it may be, you know, silicon based life, carbon based life, okay, it may be the life of the MIM, okay, but the law, if at all we have to zoom, we can zoom in. This is of course not a textbook law, but it is a formulation been given very ingeniously by Darwin, as after all he is a biologist, and it says all life evolves by differential. We have talked about explain what differential survival is. The differential survival or differential reproduction entails having a difference with competing organisms. Okay. So, all life evolves by the differential survival of replicating entities. Then cite a few examples of MIMs. Examples of MIMs, as we saw, are all the things that have to do with our cultural forms and artifacts, like tunes from music, ideas, catchphrases, fashion, ways of making tools, pots or architectural forms, even language and religion. These are all products of our culture, and these are also MIMs. Again, these may be just a snatch of a song or part of, you know, an idea, or, you know, short catchphrases, or even part of language or religion, and it can be the whole of a symphony, for instance, instead of a short patch. All these are to be considered as MIMs. Then what are the survival qualities of MIMs? The survival qualities of MIMs are that they have to live long enough to, you know, so that they can be as in genetic transmission, that they should be around, so to speak, in the mimosphere, if I may use the word. In the mimosphere, they have to be long, to be around for long in order to be transmitted at all. Then second, there has to be a certain fecundity or fertility about them, and a copying fidelity. The MIM will not remain, it will become another MIM, okay, if you change the original MIM too much. Then why does the God MIM have high survival value? And this of course is typical Dawkins, and he says that the God, the idea of God is really an idea or a MIM, right. In the it has high survival value because of its great psychological appeal. It, remember, he says, even if it is imaginary, it is effective. It is a psychological crutch that is used. It has great psychological appeal. Ideas like the afterlife, ideas like the, that we can take refuge in God after our death, etc., or that at least that the wrongs that we have received in this life will be remedied in the next, etc., and we we can go on to higher forms of, forms of life that we do not usually know about. All these are extremely appealing and helps humankind. Okay, we have to at least grant this, that it helps humankind live, otherwise there would have been probably complete chaos in the human population. Then what are the, finally, what are the two qualities we possess that may not have evolved memetically? The two qualities that we have which save us from being complete slaves to MIMs, okay, and to genes, are our capacity for conscious foresight and our capacity for genuine altruism, right. So, these are the two things which ensure that we are not slaves or slavish imitators, right, or we are not completely ruled by our genes and MIMs. Well, this is where we stop here, and this also ends the, the scientific, so to speak, right. This the work on memetics or discourse of memetics really a bridge between what we have done before, which is a scientific way of looking at culture, and to see what bioculture has to tell us about ourselves. And after this we will be moving into some other areas, and I really hope this was useful for you. Again, as I said, a controversial field, but this is something that many people have added in their understanding of culture. Why? Because memetics is a theory of culture, and that is why we need to incorporate study. Thank you so much.